The Red Army received nearly 4,000 Sherman tanks over the course of the Second World War. There's enough information in archives that are open to the public, by the way, to write several books about the Sherman. I stopped at one, but I stopped writing Sherman tanks of the Red Army not because I ran out of material or ran out of content, but because I sailed past the maximum recommended word limit by a couple of thousand words, and I didn't want to upset the publisher. There is absolutely so much more untapped content that, well, I use for these videos, among other things. Unfortunately, in English language publications, this information is very often ignored. A lot of the time, the reasoning for it that you see is something along the lines of, oh, well, those Ruskies just made up a bunch of stuff, so they don't have to admit that we helped them during the war. And unfortunately, is also something to the tune of, well, they're probably just too stupid to use our tanks anyway. Our tanks are great. As many of you know, I also do research in English language archives, so American, Canadian, British, and, well, since the British and the Canadians did receive the Sherman tank during the war as a part of the Lease program, they left their own impressions of the Shermans. And as it often happens, these reports have no shortage of complaints. And it just so happens that a large number of these complaints are pretty much the exact complaints that the Soviets did as a part of the trials carried out by the Red Army. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the impressions from the two completely separate nations fighting in, for the most part, different theaters of war, and to see, well, what did they find was wrong with the Sherman in common, and what were some complaints that were unique to one side or the other. So, one note, I like the Sherman tank. It's a good tank. I didn't write a whole book on it and about a dozen articles because I think it's bad or not interesting. That being said, this is a video about complaints. It's going to focus on the Sherman's shortcomings. It's not a, oh, this is the worst tank in the world kind of clickbait AI slop that you unfortunately see on YouTube all too much, but it is going to mostly focus on the negative aspects of the tank. It doesn't mean it was bad. Every tank has its drawbacks, but that's just the nature of this particular segment. The Sherman has a well-earned reputation for reliability, but unfortunately that wasn't always the case. In particular, this was one of the factors that delayed the Sherman's debut on the Eastern Front. Even though these tanks began to arrive in the fall of 1942, they actually didn't see battle until the summer of 1943, and even then in very, very small numbers. One of the biggest problems with the Sherman's reliability was the injector. The fuel injector became fouled with oil after just 5 to 10 hours of operation, and it needed disassembly of the engine in order to clean it. This was a very severe problem the Soviets found. They tried different kinds of injectors, including the ones that came with Valentine tanks, since the Sherman M4A2 essentially just used two Valentine engines side by side. As well as injectors from American tractors, which also used similar engines, to no avail. The Americans were of little help. According to them, this was user error, and the injectors worked perfectly stateside, but this was a significant problem in 1942 and also in 1943. So you might say it's an open and shut case. Clearly the Soviets just received a new tank, all the instructions are in English, all the measurements are in Imperial, they were doing something wrong and breaking the tank themselves. But across the Mediterranean, on the North African front, the British were finding the exact same thing, that the injectors were getting fouled with oil and the tanks would stop working. Later, British specialists noticed that the design of the injector had changed, perhaps to address the complaints that they sent to the Americans. However, that only solved the problem partially. One of the biggest causes for this issue was a faulty oil level meter, which made the crews overfill their tanks with oil, and the excess oil splashed around everywhere, including on the injectors. As the British moved to the Italian front, the issues with the injectors persisted. They would arrive rusted, incorrectly assembled, or correctly assembled, but full of debris. Things got so bad that the British actually had to take them apart when the tanks arrived in the UK, refurbish them, clean them, and then send them out to the forces. The Americans, once again, were unrepentant. They said, well, you're taking them apart. You shouldn't be taking them apart. Any problems you're introducing, doing this, they're your own fault. Warranty void when seal is opened. The British, of course, insisted that if they didn't open the injectors to clean them, they wouldn't work in the first place. So this was kind of an impasse. I don't know how this matter was settled on the British side, but for the Soviets in 1944, General McFarlane finally admitted that yes, there was a manufacturing problem that made the injectors prone to being clogged up. Better late than never, I suppose. These were far from the only assembly problems when it came to Sherman tanks. The Soviets noted that tanks arrived with poorly fitted turrets, loose bolts, leaking radiators, and all sorts of issues. The most striking issue that I've encountered in a report actually came from the British, who wrote that in a Sherman tank they received, none of the ammo rack strap buckles were actually bolted on. Some were just kind of loose in their compartments, and one of them was held on only with paint. So these kind of just sloppy manufacturing issues did unfortunately both affect both British and Soviet Shermans. I'm not going to get into every single one of these complaints, but suffice it to say that both Soviet and British QA had their hands full with arriving German tanks. Now, this is where we kind of have to make a note. There is not a single industry on Earth, not even American industry, that can go from a peacetime footing to the output required by war without suffering some temporary setbacks to quality in the process. Manufacturing defects and design defects are two different things. The engineer who designs a tank and the technologist who puts it into production are different people. And even today, the engineers and technologists are different people and don't necessarily talk to each other as often as they should. But this is the kind of thing that needs to be figured out iteratively and always takes time to iron out when a tank goes into production. However, that is little solace to the British and Soviet engineers who are receiving yet another poorly assembled Sherman tank and have to write down their complaints in their reports. These complaints, they weren't just left there on paper. They were sent back to the Americans. The Americans did put changes into production, and assembly quality of the Shermans did go up as the war went on. In my Sherman book, I do cover the war in Manchuria, and Sherman tanks were able to drive, 2,000 kilometers in the harshest possible conditions without breaking down for the most part. So the quality of Sherman tanks absolutely increased as the war went on. But speaking of Manchuria, there is another quality issue that the Soviets were particularly sensitive to, especially in 1944 and 1945 when all Soviet tanks were used as a part of long-range armored thrusts. In these cases, the biggest problem with Sherman tanks was the lifespan of the running gear, particularly the tracks, road wheels, and the suspension springs. When you are so badly outrunning your supply lines that you had to get fuel airdropped to you, it's not really possible to have ample spares with you. And, well, if your suspension spring breaks down, that can result to a mission kill of the tank, even if 99% of it is perfectly fine. Manchuria was one of the places where these complaints are the most frequent, particularly because of the high heat in the theater and the high speed of driving that had to be maintained in order to keep up with the schedule of the very, very aggressive schedule of this operation. The double road wheels of the M4A2 HVSS tanks were supposed to help with this, at least according to the Americans, but in practice, due to a manufacturing defect, most of the tires that went to the USSR actually had a very short lifespan, and hundreds of Sherman tanks had to swap out their wheels even before they made it into Manchuria. Unfortunately, I don't have post-war data from the American side, so I'm not sure if the issues with road wheel rubber were resolved after World War II. When I was reading Korean loss data, the Sherman seemed to be particularly reliable, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the This is probably another one of those issues that was ironed out with time. The British were actually experiencing the exact same problems in North Africa, to the point where the speed of Sherman tanks was capped at just 20 miles an hour outside of combat in order to reduce the wear on the road wheels. Even with the most careful usage, the heat and the terrain did their part, and the rubber would start to disintegrate after about 400 miles of driving. Spares were always hard to come by, and some crews had to keep driving on just steel rims or with disintegrating rubber on their tracks because, well, there wasn't really any alternative. Much like the Red Army, the British encountered these issues outside of North Africa and Italy and other hot theaters of war. There were reliability trials that took place in March of 1944 ahead of the Normandy landings, and one of the things the British tried was different combinations of Sherman road wheels on the tracks. Even in the sort of milder climate in Britain, T-74 tracks, so steel chevron with rubber padding on the inside, the rubber started to fall off after 421 miles of driving, and the tracks became useless. T-54 track links were more reliable, but since those track links didn't have rubber padding for the road wheels wore out faster instead. This particular trial averaged a replacement road wheel about every 50 miles of driving, which is not a great record. Moving on from the running gear, both the British and the Soviets had their complaints about the direct vision ports of the Sherman tanks. The direct vision ports turned out to be way too easy to penetrate with a bullet or a shell splinter, and well, the Soviets just kind of closed their armored shutters. The British actually welded track links over them, and tanks undergoing refurbishment in the UK would get special armored plating welded over them. This was something the Americans very much agreed with, and direct vision was eliminated on later Sherman models. More on the topic of optics, both the British and the Soviets compared about the gun sights, but for different reasons. The British didn't like that the top prism wasn't protected by anything, and that the gun sight markings were actually so thick that at longer ranges they could completely obscure the target. The Soviets complained that there was no way to zero the sight in the vertical plane, and that the markings were only applied for armor-piercing shells, and there was nothing for the machine gun or high explosive. For the British, they actually wrote the same thing about the gun sights of the M3 Lee tanks, so maybe they just decided not to repeat themselves when it came to the Sherman. I'm not sure. Both sides complained about the thin vertical armor with ammo racks behind them. Penetration of the side almost certainly resulted in an ammunition fire accompanied with detonation and total loss of the tank. The Americans attempted to resolve this issue by welding applique armor to the sides, but this was really a half measure. It only really helped as a result of a direct hit at a 90-degree angle on the ammo rack, and even then, not always. The real solution was, of course, to take the ammunition and put it under the fighting compartment floor, which the Americans eventually did. Wet ammo racks also helped, but just putting the ammunition where it's less likely to get hit makes it less likely to burn and explode. Even though the ammunition was safer as a result, the thin vertical armor was always a thorn in the Sherman's side for the duration of its combat service. Now for the unique stuff. These are issues that were only recorded by one country and not the other. Now, this didn't mean that it didn't happen. Maybe they just weren't recorded in the same sources, or they weren't recorded in the sources that I have had access to. Nevertheless, it does give us kind of a unique view about what each country expected of their tanks, including foreign ones. Let's start with the turret traverse. The British and the Soviets quite liked the oil gear turret traverse. It was a reliable mechanism. However, the British complained that there was a lot of backlash. This is not something that I found in Soviet documents, but the British, according to them, this issue could be so bad that it would require correction in the UK on certain vehicles. The British also noted that there was backlash in the elevation gear. This is also not something that I've noted in Soviet sources. When it came to the gun stabilizer, the Britain and the USSR had different approaches to it. The Soviets actually quite liked it. Both due to the fact that it improved precision on the move, but also the rate of fire on the move, since the gun didn't really bounce around that much. The British, on the other hand, had a quite negative opinion of the Westinghouse stabilizer and said that it's pretty much useless. You might as well only use it when loading the gun at close range or with the machine gun. Unfortunately, I didn't find the precise way in which each country tested these stabilizers, so maybe they expected very different things of them, but it is interesting to note the kind of very different feedback about the same design. I mentioned that both the British and the Soviets had complaints about the Sherman's vision devices, but there is actually one that only the Soviets complained about. It was vision from the turret, particularly to the sides. You could look around using the rotating periscopes, but there weren't backup fixed observation devices like there were on the T-34. This was considered to be an issue since if the periscope was damaged, you effectively became blind until you could replace the damaged prism. Now, on the later models of the T-34 and later models of other Soviet tanks, these side observation devices were actually also eliminated. So maybe the USSR revised its priorities when it came to these observation devices. Maybe there was some other reason, but the Americans didn't actually have fixed observation devices pointing sideways like they did with earlier tanks. Feedback on the Sherman's armor quality was also different, radically different, in fact. The British, in their study of damaged tanks in North Africa, came to the conclusion that the armor was of high quality. Spalling and cracking were noted, but they were rare. The Soviets, on the other hand, complained that there was spalling and cracking when tanks were hit by high explosive shells, even if the shell didn't penetrate the armor. The armor's toughness when hit with armor-piercing shells also left much to be desired, and even thick armor could be penetrated by relatively low-caliber shells. This was a complaint specifically about the early model of Sherman tanks, and in 1943 it is noted that the quality of armor of the Shermans had gone up, so it's possible that the Red Army received a bad batch of tanks, or that this was another manufacturing defect that was resolved as a result of Soviet feedback. So this is probably not the definitive list of complaints about the Sherman tank. I intentionally only included reports from highest level sources and not any Corporal Joe Schmo complaining that his tank isn't good enough because the gun can't knock out a Tiger tank at 2,000 meters. Even so, there's plenty of things to talk about. It is important to note that this wasn't complaining for the sake of complaining. These complaints were recorded, they were batched together, and they were sent back to the Americans. The Americans, for the most part, didn't sit on them. They analyzed them, and improvements were made to both production of Sherman tanks and the design in general. As you can see, the complaints were very much justified and very rarely ignored by the manufacturer. It is important to note that despite having a laundry list of issues with the Sherman tanks, both the Soviets and the British liked them quite a lot. The Red Army used the M4A2 quite extensively. It was the most popular foreign tank in the Red Army. The British, they used the M4A2, but over time, the most common Sherman tank in the British Army became the M4A4. Now, this didn't mean that the M4A4 had no problems, far from it. Maybe even more problems than the M4A2 did, but that is going to be the topic of another video.